So, what reliability do the Gospels have? Well, to start off, we know it's reliable in preservation because, well, with some exceptions, the manuscripts found over time affirm that the Gospels have not been changed for over 1900 years, discarding the New World Translation and NIV and many other translations. But if you compare the actual versions that make sense to the Greek version of the New Testament, then they're very similar. But I will not be talking about other books such as the Gospel of Thomas or the Book of Enoch because I have to finish reading them. But for now, I will be trying to be talking about the canonical Gospels and why they would be reliable. So, first off, we can affirm that the Gospels were around within the first 100 years of Jesus' death because Paul mentions that there were scriptures that state that Jesus was buried and that he rose on the third day, which the one I'm referencing is 1 Corinthians 15:4. But in my previous video, I explained why 1 Corinthians is a trustworthy source. But I'll give a quick explanation and return back to the topic at hand. The Bishop of Rome confirmed that Paul wrote a letter to Corinth. That's it. Now back to the topic. So we know that there were writings that spoke about Jesus, but how can we check which is more reliable? Well, check the ideas in those Gospels, correspond them to the other Gospels, and check the bias. Well, if there is one. So, to first off talk about the Gospels, we need to understand the main topics of the Gospels, which can be summed up in a basic timeline: his birth, his ministry, and his death. Matthew has the birth in his Gospel, but he gives a more prophetical viewpoint that is emphasized, so there isn't a more emotional touch, only factual in dealing with prophecy. And that's how his Gospel works. Like in the beginning of Matthew, it talks about the generations right before Jesus to explain the prophecy of going through the line of David. While Mark put his testimony as mainly emphasizing why he died and a bit more emotional than Matthew in comparison, which he did that in order to give us more faith, like in verses 16, 17 through 19. So, the absence of the birth doesn't really affect that gospel in particular because of how he idealizes those types of ideas. Next, we have Luke, which is most likely from the perspective of an unknown witness, but was still likely to have been written by Luke, so we should probably test the merit with Luke. First off, Luke tells us from the very beginning that this is his understanding of the events, that this was compiled for a purpose, verse 1-3, and that the testimony should be written down in order for clarification to happen, verse 1-4. So in this gospel, the timeline goes as follows for Jesus' birth: Zacharias' meeting, Mary's meeting, Jesus is born, an angel visits, Jesus visits the temple, they live in Nazareth. Though, we should probably get the other timeline real quick. An angel visits Joseph, Jesus is born, people visit, they move to Egypt, they live in Nazareth. Now that that timeline is down, we know that Luke added two things before Jesus' birth, and then the Gospels coincide with each other. But the absence of this in Matthew's Gospel makes sense, because it's more objective on being factual, while Luke tries to give more background on the facts of Matthew. And then right after Jesus' birth, an angel visits Joseph and Jesus goes to the temple. But it still leads to Jesus going to Nazareth. So we need to understand this idea of non-contradictive addition. This means that if something is added and it doesn't contradict the text, then it can't be rejected unless its merit is actually tested. So by my explanation, we know that Luke was giving details of the birth and early childhood to affirm Matthew's claims. So when he explains right beforehand, it's from the understanding that was given at the time to explain the prophecies, which is why we can't really deny Luke as a gospel just because it adds things, because it doesn't contradict and it follows the same main idea. So now, on to John's gospel. His gospel is actually prophetic, meaningful, and emotional, which is why it's called the spiritual gospel. So when John mentions Jesus' birth, it is basing off the messianic prophecy, since his birth is about the Word, which is Jesus, who was God, that stepped down to become flesh, which connects to Luke and shows the link between the Gospels and the birth of Jesus. But what about the others? Well, I explained them. When you look at why each Gospel was created, then you know how they correspond and it makes sense. But what about the bias? We'll have to say that for another video, so I shall turn this into part 2. I'm sorry that I cut the video a tad short, but I just got back home from another state and I didn't have enough time to finish the video and try and get it out in time. So I hope that isn't a problem. And that's basically all. So God bless you all. Hope to see you in the next video.